The judge had just said the words that officially ended 15 years of my life, hammering down a gavel that seemed to echo in the quiet room. This divorce is final. And in that exact second, while my ex-husband let out a breath he had been holding for months, thinking he had just pulled off the heist of the century, I leaned over to my attorney. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply whispered 2 words that would dismantle his entire world before the sun went down. Book the tickets. 10 minutes later, I was buckling my youngest into a seat on a plane, my 2 older kids sitting beside me in stunned silence, clutching the small backpacks I had packed for them in the dead of night the night before. And across town, in a bright, cheerful maternity clinic filled with pastel walls and polite smiles, all 8 members of my ex-husband's family were gathered around his mistress, waiting to hear the heartbeat of the child they were already calling their future. They were smiling. They were celebrating. They thought they had won. But what the doctor was about to say would change everything, and by the time they realized the game was fixed, I would already be 30,000 feet in the air, watching their world crumble from above. If you have ever felt underestimated, pushed aside, or made to feel small by someone who was supposed to love you, then you know exactly how I felt in that courtroom. But if you have ever dreamed of serving a cold, calculated plate of justice to someone who wronged you without ever raising your voice, then hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and turn up your volume. Get comfortable, because you are about to hear one of the most satisfying revenge stories you will ever encounter. This is the art of letting them win, only to take it all back when they least expect it. I didn't cry when the judge signed the papers. That is something people fundamentally misunderstand about moments like that. They expect tears. They expect some kind of cinematic scene, raised voices, shaking hands, someone storming out of the courtroom in a fit of dramatic passion. But by the time you actually get to that day, the tears have already been spent. I had cried months earlier, quietly in the laundry room where no one could hear me over the hum of the dryer. I had cried when I found the first message on Daniel's phone, something small, almost harmless on the surface, but written with a familiarity that didn't belong to me anymore. After that, the crying came in waves. In the kitchen while I waited for the coffee to brew, in the carpool lane at school, once even in the grocery store parking lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. I cried until I was empty, and then I dried my eyes and started planning. But not in the courtroom. In the courtroom, I was calm. "Mrs. Carter," the judge had said, glancing over his glasses, "are you in agreement with the terms as presented?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied. My voice didn't tremble. It didn't waver. It was the voice of a woman who had already made her peace with the past and was entirely focused on the future. Across the room, Daniel shifted in his chair, his expression somewhere between relief and impatience. He had always hated long processes, paperwork, waiting, anything that slowed him down. He wanted this over. So did I, but for very different reasons. The terms had been acceptable on paper, or at least they appeared to be. He kept the house. He kept most of the savings. His business accounts, which he had always guarded like a dragon guarding gold, remained untouched. I took the kids and a modest settlement that, on paper, looked like charity. To anyone watching, it would have looked like I lost. I saw the way his mother, seated in the back row with her designer purse clutched in her lap, leaned over to whisper something to his sister. I saw the faint smile they didn't quite manage to hide, a smirk of superiority that suggested they had pulled a fast one. They thought I was walking away with nothing but the burden of 3 children and a broken heart. Maybe that's what they needed to believe. Maybe that was the only way they could sleep at night, thinking I was the victim and they were the victors. When the hearing ended, Daniel stood quickly, already reaching for his phone, his mind clearly miles away from the room we were in. "Good," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "That's done." I gathered my things slowly, deliberately making sure I didn't leave anything behind. Not a pen, not a piece of paper, not a trace of the person I had been when I walked in. "Emily," he said, his tone almost casual, as if we had just wrapped up a business meeting instead of ending a 15-year marriage. "I'll have someone coordinate with you about the kids' schedule for next weekend." "I won't be available," I said. That made him pause. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time that morning. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I replied, meeting his gaze evenly, "you'll need to go through my attorney regarding the children." A flicker of irritation crossed his face, a tiny crack in his armor of indifference. "There's no need to make this difficult, Emily." "I'm not," I said gently. "I'm making it clear." For a moment, it looked like he wanted to argue, but then he exhaled, shrugged, and turned away. He always did that. He chose the path of least resistance when something didn't immediately benefit him. It was one of the reasons we were there. It was one of the reasons I was leaving. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter somehow. Or maybe that was just me. The sky was a piercing, impossible blue, the kind that makes you feel like anything is possible. My lawyer, a steady man named Robert Hayes, who had become my anchor over the past 6 months, walked beside me down the stone steps. "You handled that well," he said, his voice low. "I didn't do anything," I replied. "You did exactly what we discussed," he corrected. "You stayed composed. You didn't push." "You let him think he had it all," I nodded. That had been the plan. It is often said that the best con is the one where the mark never knows they were played until it is far too late to fix it. "Are you sure about what comes next?" he asked, lowering his voice slightly as we reached the curb. "Once we initiate, there's no going back. The wheels will be in motion and they will turn very fast." "I know," I said. "And the children? They'll be fine," I said, though my chest tightened just a little. "They need stability." "Not all of this. Not the lies, not the drama. They need to be away from here." He studied me for a moment, then gave a small, respectful nod. "All right," he said. "Call me when you land." The car was already waiting. It was a nondescript sedan, the kind of vehicle that blends into traffic, invisible and forgettable. I had arranged everything the night before after the kids had gone to sleep. 3 small suitcases hidden in the back of the closet, passports tucked into my purse, documents, a folder tucked carefully into my carry-on containing copies of everything Robert and I had spent months preparing. My daughter Lily was the first to notice something was different. She was 10 years old, too observant for her own good, with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Mom," she said quietly as we pulled away from the curb, leaving the courthouse and her father in the distance. "Where are we going?" I turned slightly in my seat to look at her. "We're taking a trip," I said. "A trip?" My son Ethan echoed from the back. He was 12, entering that age where questions were challenges. "Like vacation, something like that," I said. My youngest, Noah, just held onto his stuffed bear and looked out the window, trusting me the way only a 6-year-old can. "Is Dad coming?" Lily asked, her voice laced with that delicate hope children hold onto like a lifeline. I shook my head. "No," I said softly. "It's just us." She didn't ask anything else after that. She just nodded, a small, understanding nod that broke my heart just a little bit, and turned back to the window. At the airport, everything moved quickly. I had planned it down to the minute. Check-in, security, boarding, I had chosen a morning flight for a reason. Less time for questions, less time for anyone to notice, less time for Daniel to realize what was happening. As we settled into our seats, I helped Noah with his seat belt, then tucked a blanket around him. "You okay, buddy?" I asked. He nodded, his eyes wide. "Where are we going?" I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Somewhere new," I said, "somewhere safe." The plane began to taxi. My heart beat steadily. Not fast, not slow, just certain. As the engines roared and the ground started to fall away beneath us, I glanced out the window at the city I had called home for nearly 2 decades. I thought about the house, the kitchen, the life I had built piece by piece, and then I let it go. Because at that exact moment across town, Daniel was probably walking into that clinic, his arm around her shoulders, his family gathered close, ready to celebrate what they believed was the beginning of something new. They had no idea what was already in motion. No idea that the agreement Daniel had signed that morning contained a clause he had barely skimmed, a standard non-disclosure agreement regarding assets that was about to become his undoing. No idea that certain financial disclosures he had sworn were complete had already been quietly verified by forensic accountants Robert had hired. And they certainly had no idea that the call Robert was preparing to make would reach them before the day was over. I leaned back in my seat, closed my eyes for just a moment, and took a slow, steady breath. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't waiting for something to happen to me. I had already set everything in motion. And this time, I wasn't the one being left behind. The first time my phone buzzed after we landed, I didn't answer it. We had just stepped out of the airport into air that felt softer than the city we'd left behind. It carried a quiet kind of warmth, not just in temperature but in pace. People moved slower here, voices were lower. Even the light seemed gentler, filtered through a haze that felt like a dream. Lily noticed it too. "It's quieter," she said, adjusting the strap of her backpack. "It is," I agreed. Ethan stretched his arms over his head, trying to look like this didn't bother him, but I saw the relief in his shoulders. Are we staying here long? I looked at him, then at Noah, who was holding my hand with a kind of calm trust that made my chest tighten. For a while, I said. That was enough for them for now. The car that picked us up was modest, the driver polite, but not overly talkative. I had arranged a small rental house ahead of time. Nothing extravagant, just clean, quiet, and close to a school I had already contacted weeks earlier. Weeks, that was how long I had been preparing this part of our lives. Not days, not hours, weeks of small, careful steps. Calls made in the early morning before anyone else was awake. Emails sent from an account Daniel didn't know existed. Documents copied, organized, double-checked. I didn't rush any of it. Rushing is what gets people caught. Rushing leads to mistakes. I was slow. I was methodical. I was a ghost in my own life, preparing for the day I would vanish. By the time we reached the house, the sun was beginning to settle into that late afternoon glow that makes everything feel a little more forgiving. This is it? Ethan asked, looking at the small front yard with the overgrown shrubs. This is it, I said. Inside, the space was simple. 2 bedrooms, a small living room, a kitchen that had seen better days but was clean and functional. There were already a few groceries in the fridge, another thing I had arranged in advance. Bread, milk, fruit, the essentials for a first night. Lily walked slowly through the living room, taking it all in. It's not like home, she said. No, I said gently, it's not. She turned to me, are we moving here? I paused. There are moments as a parent when you realize the truth is too heavy to hand over all at once. You don't lie, but you don't give it all either. We're starting here, I said. She studied my face for a second longer than I expected, then nodded. Okay, that was Lily. Thoughtful, careful, stronger than she should have had to be. While the kids settled in, exploring the small yard and arguing over who got which bedroom, I stepped outside onto the small back patio and finally looked at my phone. 5 missed calls, 3 from Daniel, 2 from an unknown number I already recognized as his attorney's office. I didn't return any of them. Instead, I scrolled to Robert's name and pressed call. He answered on the second ring. You landed, he asked. We're here, I said. There was a brief pause. Not hesitation, just confirmation. All right, he said. Then we've begun. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that settle. What's happened so far? I asked. A few things, he said. Daniel's account, several of them actually, have been temporarily frozen pending review. I let out a slow breath and prompted him to continue. And the IRS has initiated a formal inquiry into discrepancies in his reported income versus actual transfers. I leaned against the wooden railing of the patio, studying the grain of the wood. Daniel had always been careful, or at least he believed he was. He thought he was smarter than the system. He's going to say it's a mistake, I said. He can say whatever he likes, Robert replied calmly. What matters is what we can prove. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. And the clause, I asked. It's been triggered, he said. Because of the non-disclosure, that opens the door for a full reassessment of asset division. In other words, the deal Daniel thought he had secured that morning was no longer the deal. I didn't feel triumph, not the way people imagine. It wasn't a rush of victory or a sense of getting even. It was quieter than that, more like balance being restored, like watching a scale finally level out after years of being tipped to one side. Thank you, I said. You don't need to thank me, Robert replied. You did the hard part. You were patient. Patience? That had been the hardest thing of all. After we hung up, I stayed outside for a few minutes longer, watching the sky shift slowly into evening. Inside, I could hear Noah laughing at something Ethan had said. Lily was opening drawers in the kitchen, organizing things without being asked. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds. For the first time in a long time, they didn't feel fragile. They didn't feel like they were waiting for the other shoe to drop. Back in the city we had left behind, things were moving much faster. I didn't see it happen in person, of course, but later I would hear about it in pieces through phone calls and second-hand accounts that all told the same story. Daniel had arrived at the clinic with his arm around her, just like I had imagined. Her name was Vanessa. She was 28, polished, confident in a way that comes from believing you've stepped into someone else's life at just the right moment and claimed it for your own. His mother had been there, beaming with a terrifyingly smug satisfaction. His father, the silent enabler, his sister and her husband. Even an aunt who rarely showed up for anything had made an appearance. 8 of them, all gathered for what they believed was the beginning of something worth celebrating. They were smiling. One of the nurses later told someone who eventually told me that it felt like a party. I could picture it perfectly. The way his mother would have taken charge, asking questions, making sure everyone knew how important this was. The way his sister would have hovered, half supportive, half curious, sizing up the woman who had taken my place. Daniel standing slightly apart, checking his phone every few minutes. Probably already seeing the missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Probably ignoring them because that's what people do when they think nothing can touch them. They are invincible in their own minds. The ultrasound room was small, dimly lit, quiet. The kind of room where secrets are usually born, not revealed. Vanessa lay back on the table, one hand resting lightly on her stomach, the other gripping Daniel's. "Are you ready?" the technician asked. She nodded, smiling that bright, practiced smile. The screen flickered to life. Shapes began to form, grainy at first, then clearer. There it was, the small, unmistakable outline of a developing life. His mother gasped softly. "Oh, look at that," she said, her voice thick with tears. "That's our grandchild." Daniel didn't say anything, he just stared. The technician adjusted the wand slightly, her expression shifting just a fraction, enough for someone paying close attention to notice. "I'm going to have the doctor come in," she said. Vanessa frowned slightly. "Is something wrong?" "It's standard," the technician replied. "Just a moment." Standard. That word has a way of calming people who don't yet realize they should be worried. When the doctor entered, he carried a tablet and a look I knew well. Professional, measured, careful with words. He greeted them briefly, then turned his attention to the screen. There was a pause, a small one, but in a room like that it stretches. It expands to fill every corner. "I'd like to ask a few questions," he said. Vanessa sat up slightly. "Is everything okay?" He didn't answer that directly. "When was the last time you had a confirmed menstrual cycle?" he asked. She hesitated, then gave a date. The doctor nodded, tapping something into his tablet. "And when did you first believe you might be pregnant?" Another date. Another nod. Daniel shifted beside her. "What is this about?" he asked, a hint of impatience creeping into his voice. The doctor finally looked at him. "It's about timing," he said calmly. "What timing?" The doctor turned the screen slightly, indicating specific measurements. "Based on the development we're seeing," he said, "the estimated timeline of this pregnancy doesn't align with what you've described." Silence, heavy, immediate. Vanessa's hand tightened on the edge of the table. "I don't understand," she said. The doctor's voice remained steady. "It suggests that conception occurred earlier than expected." Daniel's jaw tightened. "How much earlier?" he asked. The doctor met his eyes. "Earlier than your relationship would account for." No one spoke. Not his mother, not his sister, not even Daniel. Because in that moment, every smile in that room had nowhere left to go. And somewhere, not so far away, but far enough, I was standing in a small kitchen, slicing apples for my children, listening to their voices fill a home that for the first time truly felt like ours. I didn't know the exact moment the doctor said those words, but I knew they had been said because some truths have a way of surfacing right on time. No one in that room moved for several seconds after the doctor finished speaking. It wasn't the kind of silence you get when people are simply thinking. It was the kind that settles in when something has just shifted and no one knows where to stand anymore. The ground had opened up, swallowing the narrative they had all agreed upon. Daniel was the first to react. "That's not possible," he said, his voice low, controlled. "We've been together for months." The doctor didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or rush to correct him. He simply held his position, the way professionals do when they've said something that can't be taken back. "I'm only explaining what the measurements indicate," he said. "If there are questions about paternity, that's something that can be addressed through further testing." Vanessa's face had lost all of its earlier color. "There has to be a mistake," she said quickly. "You must be reading it wrong." The technician glanced at the doctor, then back at the screen. "There's no error in the scan," she said gently. Daniel stepped back from the table as if putting physical distance between himself and the situation might somehow clarify it. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered. Behind him, his mother finally found her voice. "What exactly are you saying?" she asked, her tone sharper now, stripped of all the earlier warmth. The doctor didn't soften his words. "I'm saying," he replied, "that the gestational age suggests conception occurred before the time frame you've described." There it was, clear, unavoidable. Vanessa shook her head, her breathing becoming uneven. "No," she said. "No, that's not right." Daniel looked at her, then really looked at her for the first time since they'd entered the room. Not as a prize, not as a future, but as a question mark. "Vanessa," he said slowly, "is there something you need to tell me?" She didn't answer, not right away. And in that pause, something inside that room cracked open. Because silence when a question has been asked directly is an answer of its own. The first phone call came before anyone could recover. Daniel's phone buzzed in his hand. He glanced at the screen, irritation flickering across his face. "Not now," he muttered, pressing decline. It buzzed again, same number. He ignored it a second time. On the third attempt, his father leaned in slightly. "You might want to take that," he said quietly. "Could be important." Daniel exhaled sharply, already annoyed, and stepped out into the hallway to answer. "What?" he snapped as soon as he picked up. On the other end, Robert Hayes didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Mr. Carter," he said evenly. "This is Robert Hayes, legal counsel for Emily Carter." There was a brief pause. "I thought everything was finalized this morning," Daniel replied, his tone defensive. "It was," Robert said, "based on the information you provided. And based on new findings," Robert continued, "we are initiating a formal review of the financial disclosures submitted during the proceedings." Daniel's jaw tightened. "What new findings?" "A series of transfers," Robert said, "that were not included in your sworn statements, offshore accounts, undeclared assets." Daniel stopped himself, lowering his voice as a nurse passed by, pushing a cart of linens. "That's a misunderstanding." "You're welcome to present that position," Robert said calmly, "to the appropriate authorities." A beat. "Then what authorities?" Daniel asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew. "The Internal Revenue Service has been notified," Robert replied. "As of this afternoon, several of your accounts have been temporarily frozen pending investigation." Daniel didn't speak. He just stood there in the hallway of a maternity clinic that moments ago had felt like a place of celebration. "Additionally," Robert continued, "the non-disclosure clause in your divorce agreement has now been triggered." Daniel swallowed. "What does that mean?" "It means," Robert said, "that the division of assets you agreed to this morning is subject to reassessment." Silence. "You should speak with your own counsel," Robert added. "I expect they'll be in touch shortly." And then the line went dead. When Daniel walked back into the room, everything had changed. Not just because of the doctor's words, but because of what he now carried in with him. The color had drained from his face, making him look older than I had ever seen him. "What happened?" his sister asked immediately. He didn't answer her. He looked at Vanessa again, but whatever question had been there before had shifted into something else, something colder. "Get dressed," he said. She blinked. "Daniel." "Just get dressed," he repeated, his voice flat. His mother stepped forward. "Daniel, what is going on?" He finally turned to her. "Everything," he said. That was all. Everything. Because in that single word was the unraveling of every assumption they had walked in with. The child they were celebrating might not be his. The future they were planning might not exist. And the life he thought he had secured that morning was already slipping out of his reach. Later that evening, I received my first message from him. Not a call, not a voicemail. A message. "What did you do?" I stared at the screen for a long moment. There are questions that deserve answers, and there are questions that are simply the echo of someone realizing they've lost control. I didn't respond. Instead, I set my phone down on the small kitchen counter and turned back to the stove. Lily was sitting at the table helping Noah with a worksheet the school had emailed me earlier that day. Ethan was rinsing dishes without being asked. Simple things. Ordinary things. The kind of moments that had once been overshadowed by tension I didn't even recognize at the time. "Mom," Lily said, looking up. "Are we okay?" I walked over to the table and rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. "We are," I said. And for the first time, that wasn't something I had to convince myself of. It was just true. That night after the kids were asleep, I sat alone in the quiet of the living room. The house was still unfamiliar, the creak of the floorboards, the way the light fell through the curtains, but it didn't feel temporary anymore. It felt like the beginning of something steady. My phone buzzed again. Another message. "You think this is over?" I let out a soft breath. No, I didn't think it was over. I knew it wasn't because consequences don't arrive all at once. They unfold slowly, deliberately, just like everything I had put in motion. I turned off the light, letting the room settle into darkness. And somewhere miles away, in a house that was no longer mine, and in a clinic that would be remembered for all the wrong reasons, the truth was still working its way through every corner of Daniel's life. And this time, there was no one left to shield him from it. By the next morning, the story had already begun to spread. Not publicly, not in the way people imagine scandals breaking across headlines, but quietly through the channels that matter more in a place like ours. Phone calls, conversations between attorneys, a banker asking a careful question that didn't quite sound like a question. Daniel had built his life on control, on knowing exactly who knew what and when. Now, for the first time, that control was slipping. I woke early. The house was still quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned rather than empty. For a moment, I just stood in the kitchen, letting the sunlight come through the window and rest on the counter where I had left the fruit bowl the night before. Normal. That word kept returning to me. Normal wasn't something I had realized I was missing until it was there again. I started the coffee maker and checked my phone. 2 missed calls. One from Daniel, one from a number I didn't recognize but I suspected belonged to his attorney. There was also a message. We need to talk. This has gone too far. I read it once, then set the phone down. For years, we need to talk had been something I responded to immediately. It had meant urgency, obligation, a need to fix whatever problem had just surfaced. Now it meant something else. It meant he was no longer in control of the conversation. The kids woke one by one. Noah came in first, still half asleep, dragging his blanket behind him. "Morning," he mumbled. "Morning, sweetheart," I said, handing him a glass of juice. Lily followed, already dressed, her hair pulled back neatly. "I found the school email," she said. "They want us to come by later." "That's right," I said. "We'll go this afternoon." Ethan wandered in last, taller than I remembered some days, as if he was growing faster now that the tension had lifted. "Do we have internet yet?" He asked. "We do," I said. "Why?" He shrugged, just checking. It was such a simple exchange. And yet it felt like something important. They weren't asking about Daniel. They weren't asking about what happened at the courthouse. They were adjusting quietly, naturally. By mid-morning, Robert called. "I assume you've seen the messages," he said. "I have," I replied. "He's trying to contain this," Robert continued, "but it's moving faster than he expected." "In what way?" "There's been contact from his financial institutions," Robert said. "Once accounts are flagged, they don't wait for explanations. And the IRS? They've opened a preliminary review," he said. "That doesn't mean anything is finalized, but it does mean he's now on their radar." Daniel hated being on anyone's radar. He preferred to operate in spaces where everything looked clean on the surface. "And his attorney?" I asked. "They reached out this morning," Robert said. "They're requesting a meeting." I considered that, and I told them any communication would go through me, he said, as we discussed. That was the agreement. No direct contact, no emotional negotiations, just facts. "Good," I said. There was a pause. "You're handling this well," Robert added. "I'm handling it the only way I can," I replied, which was to say I wasn't reacting. I was letting things unfold. Across town, Daniel was doing the opposite. I didn't see it myself, of course, but I could imagine it clearly enough. He would have started the day with calls. First to his bank, then to his accountant, then to his attorney. Each conversation giving him less certainty than the last, each answer raising more questions. "Your accounts are under review. We need additional documentation." There appears to be a discrepancy. Words like that. Neutral, professional, impossible to argue with. His mother would have been there, too. She always was when things began to unravel. "This is ridiculous," she would say. "There must be some mistake." Daniel wouldn't answer her. Not right away. Because somewhere beneath the frustration, something else would be taking hold. Recognition. Not of guilt. He wasn't the kind of man who saw things that way, but of consequence. The meeting with the school went smoothly. The principal was kind, the kind of woman who had seen enough families come through her doors to recognize when not to ask too many questions. "We're glad to have you," she said, handing me a packet of information. "Your children will do just fine here." Lily nodded politely. Ethan asked about sports. Noah held onto my hand a little tighter than usual, but he didn't pull away. On the drive back, Lily spoke up. "Mom," she said, "are we going to stay here for good?" I glanced at her in the rear-view mirror. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "But we're going to stay as long as we need to." She seemed to accept that. Sometimes children don't need certainty. They just need honesty. That afternoon, the call finally came. Not from Daniel, but from his attorney. "Mrs. Carter," the voice on the other end said, measured and careful. "This is Michael Levin representing Daniel Carter." "I understand," I replied. "We'd like to discuss the recent developments," he said. "There may have been misunderstandings. Any discussion should go through my attorney," I said calmly. A brief pause. "Yes, of course," he said. "We've been in contact with Mr. Hayes. However, we were hoping to resolve this more efficiently. Efficiently. That word did a lot of work in conversations like these. It is being handled efficiently, I said, through the proper channels. Another pause, longer this time. I see, he said. There was nothing else to add. Good day, Mrs. Carter. Good day, I replied and ended the call. That evening, as the sun dipped lower and the house settled into its new rhythm, I found myself sitting at the small dining table reviewing a set of documents Robert had sent over. Numbers, dates, transfers. Each line a quiet record of decisions Daniel had made long before he realized they would matter. I didn't feel anger reading them. Not anymore. Anger had a place once. It had been useful, but now it had been replaced by something steadier. Clarity. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Daniel. You could have talked to me. I read it, then set the phone aside. There was a time when I would have believed that, when I would have thought a conversation could have changed something. But conversations only matter when both people are willing to tell the truth. And for a long time, that hadn't been the case. Later, after the kids were asleep, I stepped outside again. The night air was cool, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. I stood there for a while, listening to the quiet. Somewhere far from here, Daniel was still trying to fix things, trying to pull pieces back into place, trying to understand how something he thought was finished had just begun. But this wasn't about fixing. It was about facing. And that's something no one can do for you. Inside the house, everything was still peaceful. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next problem to arrive, because the truth had already arrived for both of us. The difference was I had been preparing for it. The collapse didn't happen all at once. That's what people expect, that there's a single moment, a loud crack, something unmistakable that marks the end of everything. But real consequences don't arrive like that. They arrive quietly. One call, one letter, one conversation at a time. By the end of the week, Daniel's world had begun to narrow. Not physically. He still drove the same car, still lived in the same house, at least for now. Still wore the same tailored suits that had always made him look like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. But the space around him had changed. The people who used to answer his calls immediately were now taking longer. The ones who once sought his approval were suddenly careful with their words. Even his own family, so certain, so confident just days earlier, had grown quieter, less certain, less sure of where they stood. I learned most of this through Robert. Not in dramatic updates, but in measured summaries, the kind professionals give when they understand that information carries weight. He's attempting to move funds, Robert told me one afternoon. But with the accounts flagged, there are limits. And his business, there are inquiries, he said. Partners are asking questions. Some are distancing themselves until things are clearer. That made sense. People are loyal until risk becomes visible. And the clinic. I asked, surprising myself. Robert paused slightly. There's been no formal action there, he said. But from what I understand, the situation has changed. Changed. That was one way to describe it. Because the last piece of Daniel's carefully constructed future, the one built around Vanessa and the child they believed was his, was no longer stable. It had shifted. And when something like that shifts, everything connected to it begins to move as well. Later that day, I received a call I hadn't expected. Vanessa. I almost didn't answer. For a moment, I just looked at her name on the screen, remembering the first time I had seen it months ago, lit up on Daniel's phone, accompanied by a message that had changed everything. Back then, it had felt like the beginning of the end. Now it felt like something else. I answered, hello. There was a pause on the other end, then a voice that sounded smaller than I remembered. Emily? Yes. Another pause. I didn't know who else to call. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't have words, but because I wanted to choose them carefully. What do you need? I asked, a breath. I didn't know, she said, about the accounts, about any of that. I didn't think you did, I replied. She let out a shaky exhale. They're saying the baby. She stopped, her voice catching. They're saying it might not be his. I closed my eyes briefly. I heard, I said. I swear I thought the timing was right, she continued quickly. I didn't plan this. There was something in her voice that I recognized. Not innocence, but uncertainty. The kind that comes when a story you've told yourself begins to fall apart. Vanessa, I said gently. This isn't something I can help you with. I know, she said quickly. I know that. I needed to say it out loud to someone who would understand. Understand. That word carried more weight than she realized. Because understanding doesn't mean agreement. It doesn't mean forgiveness. It simply means seeing something clearly for what it is. I hope you figure things out, I said. And I meant it. Not because I wished her well in the way people expect, but because clarity, however painful, is better than living in something that isn't real. "Thank you," she said quietly. Then the line went dead. That evening, I thought about that call longer than I expected. Not because it changed anything, but because it reminded me of something important. No one enters a situation like that believing they're the one who will lose. Vanessa had stepped into my life thinking she was gaining something. A future, a place, a man who seemed secure, successful, certain. She hadn't seen the parts of him that I had spent years learning to recognize. The shortcuts, the quiet justifications, the belief that as long as something looked right, it was right. Now she was seeing them. And once you see something like that clearly, you can't unsee it. By the weekend, the calls from Daniel had stopped. Not because he had given up, but because he had shifted strategies. That's what he always did. When one approach stopped working, he moved to another. This time, it came in the form of a formal request. Robert forwarded it to me late Saturday morning. "They're proposing a meeting," he said when I called him. "I assumed they would," I replied. "They want to revisit the terms," he continued. "Privately. Of course they do, because privacy offers something the public process does not. Control, negotiation, the ability to reshape a narrative before it becomes fixed. What do you recommend?" I asked. Robert didn't hesitate. "We proceed as planned," he said. "There's no advantage to stepping outside the current process." I nodded. "I agree." There was a brief silence. "You're not interested in a settlement?" he asked, not because he didn't know the answer, but because it needed to be said out loud. "I already agreed to one," I said. "That's true," he replied. "And now we're simply correcting the parts that weren't accurate," I added. "Exactly," he said. That afternoon, I took the kids to a small park a few blocks from the house. Nothing special. A swing set, a few benches, trees that cast long shadows. As the day moved toward evening, Ethan found a basketball hoop and joined a group of boys his age. Lily sat beside me on the bench reading. Noah ran back and forth between us, his laughter light and unguarded. I watched them for a long time, not thinking about Daniel, not thinking about court, just watching. At one point, Lily closed her book and looked at me. "You're different," she said. I smiled slightly. "How?" She considered that. "Quieter," she said. "But not sad." I thought about that. "I think I'm just not carrying as much anymore," I said. She nodded as if that made perfect sense. And maybe it did, because children notice weight even when they can't name it. They feel it in the way you move, the way you speak, the way you sit in a room. And when it's gone, they feel that too. That night, as I tucked Noah into bed, he looked up at me with sleepy eyes. "Mom," he said, "are we staying here tomorrow?" "Yes," I said. "And the next day?" "Yes." He smiled, satisfied. "Okay, simple, certain enough." Later, after the house was quiet again, I sat by the window looking out at the street. A few lights. A passing car. The steady rhythm of a place that didn't know anything about the life we had left behind. Somewhere else, Daniel was still trying to hold things together, still trying to find a way to stop what had already begun. But some things can't be stopped. They can only be faced. And in the quiet of that small house, with my children safe and asleep just a few steps away, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to fully feel before. This wasn't just about things falling apart. It was about something else taking shape, something steadier, something real. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The call came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing a cup, watching the water run clear, when my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in days. Daniel. For a moment, I considered letting it ring. That had become my habit, letting his attempts pass by without acknowledgement, allowing the distance to do its work. But something about the stillness of that day made me answer. "Hello." There was a pause on the other end. Not long, but long enough for me to recognize something had shifted. "Emily," he said. His voice was different, not the sharp, controlled tone I had grown used to over the years, not the quiet irritation that used to sit just beneath the surface of everything he said. This was something else. "Tired, Daniel." Another pause. "I didn't expect you to pick up," he admitted. "I almost didn't," I said. He let out a short breath, not quite a laugh. "Fair enough." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. And in that silence, I realized something I hadn't expected. I wasn't bracing myself anymore. There was no tightening in my chest, no anticipation of where the conversation might turn, just space. "What do you need?" I asked finally. He didn't answer right away. "I wanted to talk," he said. "Not about the case, not about lawyers, just talk." I leaned against the counter, looking out the window. "That's not something we're very good at," I said. "I know," he replied. There was no defensiveness in his voice, just acknowledgement. That alone would have been enough to unsettle me once. Now it simply registered as new. I'm not calling to argue, he continued, or to convince you of anything. Then why are you calling? I asked. Another pause. Because I think I finally understand what you meant, he said. I didn't respond. I let him continue. When you said you were making things clear, he added, I didn't hear it at the time. I thought you were just being difficult. I almost smiled at that. That sounds like you, I said quietly. I know, he said again. There it was. That word repeated but not empty. I thought I had everything handled, he went on. The finances, the house, the future. I thought once the divorce was over, things would settle. And now, I asked. Now nothing is settled, he said. Everything's uncertain. I could hear it in his voice, not panic, not even fear, just the unfamiliar weight of not knowing. And Vanessa? I asked. The name sat between us for a moment. She's gone, he said. I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't need to. Left, I said anyway, more as confirmation than curiosity. She moved out 2 days ago, he replied. Said she needed time to think. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. That makes sense, I said. Another silence. This one felt different. Less heavy, more honest. I'm not asking you to come back, he said after a moment. That surprised me. Not because I expected him to ask, but because he chose to say it out loud. I know that's not possible, he continued. I think I knew that before the papers were even signed. I closed my eyes briefly, letting that settle. There are things people realize too late, and then there are things they realize just in time to understand them. What are you asking then? I said. He hesitated. Just a chance to do this better, he said. For the kids, that part mattered. Not because of him, but because of them. They deserve something stable, he added, even if it's not us. I thought about Lily sitting at the table that morning, focused on her schoolwork. Ethan finding his place on a new court with new faces. Noah asking if we'd still be here tomorrow. They didn't need perfection. They needed consistency. They do, I said. And I haven't been that, he admitted. No argument there. I can't change what's already happened, he continued. But I can try to be better going forward. I let out a slow breath. This was the part where, in the past, I would have softened. Where I would have taken responsibility for smoothing things over, making space for him, adjusting my expectations. But that wasn't where we were anymore. Daniel, I said, this isn't about trying. He went quiet. It's about showing up, I added, consistently. Not when it's convenient, not when things are falling apart, just consistently. I understand, he said. I believed that he thought he did. Whether he actually would was something time would answer. There are going to be boundaries, I continued, clear ones, I expect that, he replied. And communication goes through the structure we've set, I added. No surprises, no side agreements, okay, simple, direct. That was new, too. I'm not looking to take everything from you, I said after a moment. I know, he said. But I'm not going to protect you from the consequences of your choices, I added. I know that, too. Another pause. Emily, he said. Yes, I'm sorry. The words were quiet, not dramatic, not polished, just there. I stood there for a long moment holding the phone, listening to the silence that followed. There was a time when those words would have meant everything. Now they meant something else. They meant he was beginning to see. And sometimes that's all an apology really is. I hear you, I said. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't rejection either. It was simply acknowledgement. That's more than I deserve, he replied. I didn't answer that because what people deserve isn't something I needed to decide anymore. After we hung up, I stayed by the window for a while. The afternoon light had shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. Inside the house, everything was still, steady. I could hear Lily in the other room explaining something to Noah in a patient, careful voice. Ethan's footsteps moved down the hallway, purposeful, grounded. Life ongoing, uninterrupted. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, Lily looked up at me. Was that Dad? She asked. It was, I said. She studied my face. Is he okay? I considered that. He's figuring things out, I said. She nodded slowly. Are we going to see him? Yes, I said. In time, in a way that works for all of us. That seemed to settle something in her. Okay, she said, and that was enough. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the house had gone quiet again, I sat at the table with a notebook in front of me. Not legal documents, not plans, just thoughts. I wrote down a few things. What mattered, what didn't. What I wanted my children to remember from all of this. Not the conflict, not the details, but the way we moved through it with steadiness, with clarity, with a kind of quiet strength that didn't need to prove itself. I didn't know exactly what the next months would look like. There would be hearings, adjustments, more conversations, but for the first time, I wasn't trying to control the outcome. I was simply present for it, and that made all the difference. Because in the end, this was never really about winning. It was about building something that didn't depend on someone else's choices to remain standing, and that was already happening. There's a moment after everything is settled when you finally understand what it was all for. Not in the middle of the arguments, not in the courtroom, not even in the quiet hours when you're making decisions no one else sees. It comes later, when the noise is gone, when the outcome is no longer uncertain, when you're standing in a life that feels steady. It was a Sunday morning when I felt it, nothing special about the day, the kind of morning that used to pass without notice. Sunlight came through the kitchen window, soft and even. The coffee was already made. Noah sat at the table coloring something carefully, his tongue pressed lightly against his lip in concentration. Ethan was outside shooting a basketball against the small hoop we'd set up in the driveway. And Lily was reading. Not because she was avoiding anything, not because she needed a distraction, but because she wanted to. I leaned against the counter and watched them for a long moment. No tension, no waiting. No sense that something might go wrong at any second, just life. Daniel had been consistent. That was the word I kept coming back to, not perfect. Not suddenly transformed into someone new, but consistent. He called when he said he would. He showed up to scheduled visits. He listened more than he spoke. And when he didn't know what to say, he didn't pretend. That mattered. Not to me in the way it once might have, but to the kids. Lily had started to relax around him again. Ethan still kept a bit of distance, but he didn't shut down the way he used to. Noah simply accepted what was in front of him, the way children often do when they feel safe enough to do so. There were boundaries, clear ones. We didn't blur lines. We didn't revisit the past. We focused on what was in front of us. And slowly, something steady began to take shape. The legal process continued as expected. There were meetings, adjustments, final reassessments of assets that reflected what had actually been there, not what had been presented. I didn't push for more than what was fair, and I didn't accept less than what was right. In the end, it wasn't about reclaiming everything. It was about correcting what had been misrepresented. That distinction mattered because fairness doesn't require punishment. It requires balance. Vanessa never called again. I heard through the same quiet channels that carry information in ways people don't always notice that she had left the city entirely, moved somewhere else, started over. I didn't think about her often. And when I did, it wasn't with anger. It was with a kind of distant understanding. We had both been part of the same story, just from different sides of it. And in the end, we both had to face what was real. Months passed, not quickly, but steadily. The kind of steady that builds something you can actually stand on. The kids settled into school. They made friends. They developed routines that belonged to them, not to the life we had left behind. I found work. Nothing that needed explanation or approval. Just something honest, something that allowed me to be present for them and for myself. And in the quiet moments, I realized something I hadn't expected. I wasn't angry anymore, not at Daniel, not at his family. Not even at the years that had led us here. Because anger, when you carry it long enough, becomes something else. It becomes weight, and I had already put enough of that down. One afternoon, as I sat on the same bench in the small park we'd come to know so well, Lily turned to me. "Mom," she said, "are you happy?" The question was simple, but it held more than she probably realized. I thought about it, not quickly. Not in the way people answer when they think they're supposed to say yes. I thought about the mornings, the quiet, the absence of tension. The way I no longer felt like I had to anticipate someone else's next move. I said finally. She smiled, not surprised, just satisfied, as if that was the answer she had already known. That night after the kids were asleep, I sat by the window again. The same window, the same quiet street, but everything felt different. Not because something extraordinary had happened, but because something ordinary had been restored. Peace. Not the kind that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from no longer needing to. I thought about the day in the courtroom. The moment the judge said, "This divorce is final," how it had sounded like an ending, how it had felt like a closing door. But it wasn't. It was a beginning, not of a new fight, but of a new way of living, one that didn't require me to prove anything, one that didn't depend on someone else's choices, one that allowed me to stand quietly in something that was mine. If there's anything I would say to someone standing where I once stood, it wouldn't be about strategy or timing or even justice. It would be this: pay attention to what is real, not what is promised, not what is assumed, not what looks right from the outside, what is real. Because in the end, that's the only thing that holds. And when you build your life around that, you don't have to chase anything. You don't have to prove anything. You simply live. If this story found you at a moment when things feel uncertain, I hope you take something from it. Not the details, not the conflict, but the reminder that steadiness is possible. That clarity comes, even if it takes time. And that sometimes, the quietest decisions are the ones that change everything. Looking back on the entire ordeal, it is clear that justice is not always a loud, explosive event. Sometimes, justice is simply the truth finally finding the light of day. It is the realization that the life you were living was built on a faulty foundation, and having the strength to walk away and let it collapse. For years, I felt trapped by the expectations of others, by the image of a perfect family that Daniel was so desperate to project. But in the end, that image was nothing more than a painting left out in the rain. The colors ran, the canvas buckled, and eventually it fell apart. My revenge wasn't about hurting Daniel. It was about reclaiming myself. It was about showing my children that they don't have to accept being treated as an afterthought. It was about proving to myself that I was capable of building a sanctuary from nothing but determination and love. The irony is that by giving Daniel what he thought he wanted, the freedom to be with someone else, the house, the money, I actually gave him the rope he needed to hang his own happiness. I didn't have to pull the lever. I just had to step out of the way and let gravity do the rest. If this story gave you chills, or if you found yourself nodding along to the quiet satisfaction of a well-executed plan, smash that like button and let us know in the comments. Tell us, what is the most satisfying revenge you have ever witnessed or heard about? And of course, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. We have plenty more tales of justice, karma, and people getting exactly what they deserve coming up. Until next time, remember the truth always comes out eventually. Thanks for listening.